Have you ever wondered what are the biggest entrepreneurs who podcast doing on their show? What are they focusing on their content strategy? What format are they utilizing? And how are they using podcast platforms to grow, get to more audience members, and selling their products? Well, I decided to dive exactly into that. I'm Anna Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. And here on the show, I provide you with practical tips that I do on my show, but that I also share with my clients who are multilingual, independent podcasters, and also leaders in their industry. So I decided to look into some of these three elements. So content strategy, episode format, and best practices within podcast platforms. So if you want to know who these two people are, stay tuned because they were the two names that came up quite frequently in my community, so I decided to dive in. Let's go. If you ask anyone who their favorite podcaster is, you probably will hear 300 different answers. I know that as a podcast expert, whenever I talk to anyone, when I meet new people, when I go to podcast conferences, or even when I'm like with friends and like, hey, who are you listening to right now? The answers are going to be incredibly different. And so I decided to look into people who kind of kept coming up time and time again in my circles, not only like podcast experts, my clients, people that I talk to, and these two names, and I wanted to be kind of like intentional of these people who have very successful podcasts and that have successful businesses as well. And I kind of picked two people who have like already cemented their position as leaders in the industry, who have achieved so much, but also I wanted to look from the perspective of kind of like a diverse lens, which is many of you, and I know that representation matters. So I'm going to be looking into Jasmine Star, the Jasmine Star show, and Chris Doe's The Future. So I want to give you a few things that later in this season, what I'm going to be doing is actually talking to Jeremy Enns from the Podcast Marketing Academy to look through the trend report that he has released for a few years now. What are podcasters doing to market their shows and how are they successful? So it's going to be like kind of like a complementary to this episode. So if you want to kind of hear more on how different podcasters are marketing their show, definitely know that later in the season, I'm going to be releasing episodes around there. So what am I looking at? This episode, I'm going to be looking at these two entrepreneurs who have a podcast. So they started their business and the podcast came later. Other things about them is that they already have a successful business and the podcast is only amplifying that. These are not people who basically developed the business through the podcast, or the podcast itself is the business. And then they all have teams. So whether you have a team of 2 or of 1 besides yourself, or you have a team of 5, keep that in mind as I go through some of these elements. Both of them have released at least 300 podcast episodes. So there are people who have been podcasting for quite a while. And at the time of the recording, they don't have kind of like exclusive streaming agreements with any platform. So you can listen to their show, is publicly available. And both of them use this strategy, which is the serve first, sell later. So let's look at Jasmine Star. So how the methodology for this is that I looked at those 3 elements, right? Like the content strategy, the episode format, and the best practices within podcast platforms. And so when we look at Jasmine Star, when she launched her podcast, she actually already had a name for herself in the business world. And by the way, of course, I'll include everything in the show notes, but this is going to be a more visual episode. I'm going to put up some kind of screenshots of things that I'm talking about. Now, Jasmine Star has the classic podcast that is based more on like through like the celebrity approach, because she has she has notoriety in her industry, right? She is a business owner. She pivoted her business from teaching people how to create a photography business, how to grow a business, to then specifically work with business owners. And she transitioned that business into basically telling people how to scale from 7 figures to 8 figures. So throughout these 600 podcast episodes that she has gone through, her business has shifted, but the name of the podcast hasn't changed. But again, this goes completely against what I would recommend if you are just someone who is starting out, or you have basically a smaller community. You don't have someone like Jasmine, who has hundreds of thousands of people in her email list, in her YouTube, in her podcast, and on her Instagram as well. Keep that in mind. That's something that if you're just starting your podcast, you do not want to name your podcast as your name. Sure, sounds great because then, people associate it with you. But let's be honest. If you were to Google the topic they're an expert in or your name, how many more results would you get from the topic itself, right? So for her situation, not the case. What I find that is really interesting through the content strategy that she is using is that she has kind of a combination of her expertise breakdown because she sells products and services. I think she has a membership at the moment, but I think she has a suite of products. So she educates on her show. She also does networking with decision makers, and I've seen her have guests that definitely brought in some audience. And one of the things that I found really interesting is that actually she had Chris Do on her podcast, and I didn't necessarily saw them as people who would be in the same room. She is very, very kind of straight to the point, but she's, I would say, very tactical. But Chris has both of those sides, kind of a more dreamer, more futuristic, whereas Jasmine is more of a practical gal. But what I think is really interesting is that she is one of those people that I cannot listen to her podcast in more than a 1.2 speed, because she is like me. She speaks really, really fast. And fun fact, the only two people that I need to listen to their podcast on regular speed, it's her show and Alex Hermoso's The Game. It's one of those people that her mind goes 1,000 miles all the time, and she has really interesting approaches to her content. And so one thing that I appreciate, and that I get clients, and that sometimes I get clients that get a little bit defensive with this strategy, is that they think that they cannot recycle content, or that the podcast is a thing of itself. Both of these experts, they leverage the podcast in all different facets of their business, and they're working smarter, not harder. Both of these hosts are, worth loads of money. And so they are busy. And so to me, whenever I think about what you should do, this is one strategy that I think that you can replicate. And so let's look at, for instance, some of examples of episodes that she's used. She's done a webinar. She's done kind of day in the life of a founder. She's repurposed content from a panel that she attended. It was the live recording of an event. She's also used content from kind of a live Instagram she did. So she had a Q&A with her audience, and she expanded on some questions that were asked by the audience, which is one of the things that I tell my audience all the time. And if you're listening to the show, I tell you as well that is super important to really create content that taps into specific questions your audience has, because not only people who maybe missed that live on Instagram will want to know what happened, and you can expand on that on the show. You will tap into that thing that is oh wow, I asked that question. I really wanted to know her thoughts on it. And even if you didn't ask that question, it just feels like she's in your head, right? So it's a really cool way to tap into our listeners' fears, listeners' pain points, and how we can help them basically solve those pain points. Now, other things that she has done is that I noticed that she has used replays, and this is where I think is so clever. So she used replays that were actually not introduced by her, but one of her staff members. And so she will go, hey, here's Laura, Jasmine's team manager. This episode is the replay from an original interview that we did. This is what we're doing. And I think that was such a cool way to, not coming from a place of ego, probably just because she's super busy, right? And so I thought it was really interesting, because the first time I was like, oh, wait, who's this? But then once you become kind of a frequent listener of the show, you kind of expect that. So that is something that they did. What I find as a new opportunity is looking through the AI side of this. There's tools like 11 Labs that I think would be really interesting to leverage. So basically, it pulls from audio that she already has recorded, and you write it down, and it will generate those lines specifically as if like she had spoken them. So that's something that you can do if you don't have team members. But I thought it was like a not ego-driven decision that I thought it was really clever. Then next, in terms of the show format, she did incorporate video recently, but if you go on her Spotify, she is using a show that still works as audio only, which is really important. Apart from that webinar, to be honest, I was driving, so maybe it was me. Let's just say my attention was fragmented. But I didn't think that webinar, there was like a lot of like visual elements, and I was like, I'm not following. But it was still relevant. I was still retaining information. But apart from that, everything really works as an audio only. What I like that is that she's really testing new formats, and she's listening to audience feedback. So if you're not doing this, definitely, don't try a new concept every other week, but try things and have fun with it. And then last but not least, one thing that she does is that, again, as I said, she engages with her audience on Instagram. That's one platform that she really uses very well. And what was surprising is that she said this thing. She said, hey, I tried them as possible to be on Instagram and reply to messages. Now, I don't know if she manages the comments, but she says, I try or ask my team to shortlist messages so I can go and answer. And y'all, let me tell you, I think it was like at the end of the year, I got my Spotify Wrapped and I shared it. And, literally Alex Hermosi, Jasmine Starr, and Christo were my top 3 most played podcasts. I binged those podcasts at the time. And, all of those with recommendations by other people. And what I thought was really interesting is that she sent me a voice message. And even though she said it on the show that she did that, I was still surprised to have her say something along the lines of like, hey, Anna, I'm so excited that you got to listen to the show all this year, like throughout the year. That's so exciting. And I was like, oh my freaking God, it's her. And so if you're not using the strategy of sending voice notes to your audience, you are missing out, because let me tell you, if I thought, okay, I know that she does this, but for me to know that she probably has hundreds and hundreds of messages. So the intention behind saying, hey, I'm going to make sure that I go with the extra mile to a super fan and send them a voice note just really stuck to me as like such an amazing practice that, again, anyone can replicate. And I do that as well. For the people that follow me on Instagram, I will send a voice message and I get the same reaction. People go, oh my God, I can't believe you're talking to me. It's so weird. I listened to you in the car and now you're here saying my name. And so that is something that, again, you can do 100%. So let's move into episode format. What type of episode? What's the structure? And kind of like what's the medium? Both her and Christo are episodic, so weekly episodes, and they're a combination of solo episodes with interviews. If you are a business owner, you have to use solos, because if you have a product you want to talk about, if you are thinking about launching a product, if you're trying to come from a position of authority, you need to talk directly to your audience and make space for their one-to-one. Now, what I find really interesting about Jasmine's podcast is that even when she's doing interviews, she is so intentional about talking to you. And sometimes she goes, whoa, you just said so many different things. I want to make sure that if the listeners are, that they are following along. So can you repeat that for us again? And so she brings you to the room, which I find that is really, really good. And so I think it's very lighthearted in that sense. And she keeps the interview very curious, and she doesn't use a lot of returning guests. And even on the interviews, you feel like you're a part of it, but she's also a very warm person. So it kind of feels like, even though it is educational primarily, and again, that falls into the 2 categories. People either listen to you to be entertained or educated. And so basically her show is, part of the funnel to become a customer, to consume her content and monetize it that way. But what I think that is also awesome is that she really has a lot of variety on her episodes. So the guests are also going to be very long. They're kind of like almost like live to tape. There's minimal editing happening in most of them. But she basically does anything from, what did I have here? Under like 14 minutes all the way to over an hour. And then how is the episode structure itself? You have a short ad that it's not on every episode, so it's probably dynamically inserted. You have kind of talking points about her products, or maybe she has an opening or she's launching a product. So it's right a pre-roll right in the beginning of the episode. Then there's a hook. So the thing that she's talking about, if she's introducing a guest or a topic, she dives into the topic. And then at the end, there's a call to action. There's no break, and there's no, let's just say there's no kind of like pre-planned mid-roll. So that means that she doesn't use other people's ads on her content. And I was looking through the Spotify. She does have video now, and she records in person, like in the studio, which creates really nice graphics. And so I thought that she would use video on Spotify, and she doesn't. She's only using audio only. So I thought that that was something to keep in mind that you can do too. Now, let's move into basically the best practices followed in podcast platforms. So she's recorded over 600 episodes according to Listen Notes, and the cover art is herself. So again, the Jasmine Star Show, the whole cover is a picture of her, and you knowing that is, I find that maybe it's like an Easter egg, that because she used to be a photographer, you know, it makes sense for her to have a photo of herself. I'll be honest, in terms of fonts, it's not necessarily the most easy to read, but you can still read it okay, right? It's not necessarily like the chunkiest font that will do to read. Let's move into her podcast description, which are things that, by the way, I work with clients on, and that's one of the most important things if you are trying to grow your podcast through keywords and organic discovery. This is really important. The title of your show, the description, and some of the things that I'm going to dive in a second. But what I was surprised about, basically the description of her show, is that is very straight to the point. And so even though she's kind of a playful person, and I'll already give a preview, I thought that the Chris Do show as well, like both descriptions played it super safe. And when I'm working with clients, we work through specific elements. But the one thing that she definitely did very well is that within the first 2 to 3 lines, the show promise is there. So it says, the Jasmine Star Show is a conversational business podcast that explores what it really means to turn your passion into profits. So it's kind of a little generic, but it still talks about passion and profit. So if you're listening to this, you're thinking, okay, probably it's going to be like a realistic approach to this. And then that's when it brings the relatability, because it says, a law school dropout turned world-renowned photographer and expert business strategist, host Jasmine Star delivers her best business advice every week with a mixture of inspiration, wittiness, and a kick in the pants. So there's a little bit of like fun there, right? A little line that gives you a little bit of fun. But for most of it, it positions her as the expert to go, hey, this is what she, why she is an expert and why you can trust her. And then it goes again on the Jasmine Star Show. So it kind of makes me wonder if they redid this kind of description a few times and they kind of just left it, because there's no reason why you should have the podcast name twice, because it's not necessarily like a keyword. It's not like business advice for entrepreneurs, or you know, trying to scale your business to 8 figures. Like, there's nothing about that, because his next section says, on the Jasmine Star Show, you can expect raw business coaching lessons, honest conversations with industry peers, and most importantly, technical tips and a step-by-step plan to empower entrepreneurs to build a brand, market it on social media, and create a life they love. I'll be honest, after reading this again, I kind of am gonna guess that this section that I read you right now, that is what the description was, to be honest, because this is more specific and practical, and it even talks about, like, you know, on the weekly episodes, that it kind of does say more than that first is a little generic. So I wonder, like, that's something that when I used to do production, we would do as well, right? Like the host would tell me, hey, we need to incorporate more elements. And sometimes it's like, it will do for now. And then when you look back, I'm like, oh, maybe we can tweak that. Moving into the categories, her podcast only has 2 categories. So it has business and marketing. And what I found really interesting is that her show only has 270 ratings. It's likely that her audience is primarily on Apple Podcasts, so that's probably why. And it's something that I forget to mention is that it talks about the third person. Because she is quite known in the industry, it makes sense that it's written in third person. I personally advise people to write it in the first person because I think that podcasts are supposed to be intimate. And if you are a business owner who's trying to connect to the listener and trying to create something that feels approachable, it kind of shouldn't have the third person because it creates distance. Think about it like social media, right? Most times you're writing social media in the first person. Same thing. Now let's move into titles. Titles are super important for podcast discovery, and I do have actually an episode coming up about podcast discovery on podcast platforms, podcast search optimization. And for that, I'm actually going to be talking to Jen from the Asha team later, and I'm going to be doing that interview in France. Would you believe it? Haha. So, all right, side notes. Let's look into the titles. So Jasmine doesn't use numbers, and this is something that is like kind of a point of contingency for a lot of people. I always recommend using numbers, even though it is not suggested on Apple Podcasts, because when you have like 600 episodes and you want to refer to a specific episode, it's easier to tell your listeners to find episode number, whatever, right? Especially if you're trying to optimize the titles and you change titles. If you set a title and then you change it for whatever reason, your listeners may not be able to find it, right? So I think it's very important. In terms of how the titles are structured, they're very descriptive and outcome-based, which is great to make people click. And it doesn't lead with the guest's name, which is, as I've said before, a big no-no, and they're not vague as well. So 5 stars in there. In terms of show notes, I thought that it was really good that they previewed on what the title was. It kind of created a little bit of a teaser, and it was quite good to lead the listener to click if they were like unsure about the episode. In terms of the depth in the show notes, they were not really maximizing the 4,000 characters, or at least like 3,600. So you should include as much as possible. What they did do well is that they include chapters to guide users through navigation within the episode and help SEO. They did have links to previous episodes and back to her website and her guests as well, and a link to the newsletter. So those things, check. Super good. I also recommend that. Now, in terms of the ads, she had a pre-roll about her products, and she was having guests that were popular or that had big audiences. So you can really tell that she's using a strategy for networking, for also people that were like connected to her in some point. I think that at some point, and this is me pulling from memory right now, but I think that when she had people that were guest teachers on her programs before, as well as a way to talk about it, so that's something that you can use, is still successful in 2025. And then on YouTube, just as a side note, she actually separated video from the audio-only playlist. So that's the only thing that I'm going to say. She had both episodes, audio and video. Now, let's move to Chris Do. Chris Do's podcast is called The Future with Chris Do. It's mainly about design, technology, marketing, business, philosophy, and personal development. And this has been a podcast, one of my favorites, and so many podcast experts mentioned that they listen to this show because Chris, he is a very successful designer, and what makes him very successful is that he has kind of like a vision of impact legacy Both of them actually are children of immigrants, but what is really cool is that he has both his left side and his right side of the brain very engaged. So he can be very analytical, yet very creative as well. And so Chris used to run an ad agency based in LA. He worked with huge names, really popular. I'll put the links on the podcast, of course, in the show notes, but what I find really interesting is that Chris has released almost 400 episodes, and I've been listening for probably about 2 years now. So I've seen kind of like the podcast evolve. It didn't used to be video, and then it became video. And if you see Chris Do, he's like very, again, as a designer, he dresses in a very creative way. He has a very strong look. And what I think is fascinated about his brand, and I had one of my clients, both of us, he was actually a guest on her podcast, and that's how I've heard about him. And what I thought it was really incredible is that he does expertise breakdowns like Jasmine does. But one type of episode that he does that I found fascinating is role playing in real time with his guest about sales. And so what basically he was like, oh, you're a designer and you have to sell me your stuff. And maybe the client is saying like, why should I pay you if, I haven't seen the outcome of the work? And so that role play in real time really shows you how he is as a coach. And as I was listening to that, I'm like, I love his content. He's one of the brightest podcasters that I follow. But let me tell you, the type of coaching that he has would not work with my style of being coached, I guess. And so that's perfect, right? Like you want people to go, I love his coaching style. I want him to be my coach, or repel people and say, love his content. I don't think I would thrive being coached by him, right? So it's really important that in your marketing, you're very, very clear. And that did it for me. How he's using the show besides educating is networking. You can really tell he's talking to highly influential people, but he's talking to people who are also aspirational and really, again, talking about legacy. I think it's really big thinking content, the future and technology. One of my favorite episodes was actually with Sean Cannell, I don't know how to pronounce his name, from Think Media. This was an actual episode that Chris was on Sean's podcast, and he used that as a replay on his show. So that is something that I was like, I never heard Sean's content before as a podcast. I've seen some of his videos online, but not necessarily all of it. So I thought that was like a great way to introduce me to Sean. And hearing guest Chris versus host Chris was really interesting. So that's something that still continues to be used. I think it's a great way to showcase a different side of you as a host and still like really good expertise. And what is really cool about using that strategy is that you can be a guest on someone's podcast and realize that, wow, like we really vibe. Let me have you again. Having returning guests, which is something that I see in his strategy a lot. He has either series with another person that he really vibes with, or he has someone come in, maybe a few months later or something like that. Something else that he does is 2-part conversations, so part 1 and part 2, because his interviews are really long at times. They tend to be at least 1 hour or 45 minutes with guests. And so that is a highly strategic approach that you can have. I actually have done this and have advised clients that if you have someone who you can talk to either about 2 separate topics, or that you realize as you are in the interview that there's just too much, you're talking a lot, what you can do is like either in the moment or later record an intro and an outro and cut that interview in logical parts, right? So I think that that's a great way to make more of your content. One thing that I noticed is that they do something on video that I don't appreciate as a listener, and I heard a lot of podcast experts talk about this as well, and that actually they did test this with clients. So sometimes when you're using a YouTube video and you have those sound effects to draw attention of the listeners, of new listeners, should I say viewers, really, it's a way to keep people engaged. And that does not necessarily make sense if you're listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because you're like, I don't see what this is. I don't know what this is. And also, I personally am not a fan of using sound effects and kind of like music as a bed or to create tension and emotion is that, to me, unless you really have a person with really good ear, a really good sound designer, most times it actually distracts from the point that that person is trying to make. And I've heard multiple times where the song was kind of like almost like very dramatic, and this person was talking about a happy moment. So there was a disconnect because they just always use those, like maybe those three pre-recorded like sound effects, and it was just always the same thing. And so I thought that, like, as a user, created some points of disconnection, so you have to be really intentional when you're using them. And then let's look into the episode format, shall we? I'm trying to be a little like faster here because there's so much to cover and I want you to stay engaged. Now let's look into the type of content that Chris does, episodic as well, and weekly. I realized that there was a point in Chris's podcast that he did more solos than interviews, and then it kind of shifted, or at least like it was maybe like 2 interviews or 3 every like other month or something. But then it just now is basically the ratio, like 1 solo per like 4 to 5 interviews. I think he's like in a growth stage of the podcast. What I find is that the interviews, again, are very fascinating, and also it pushes him beyond his comfort zone. And I think that that ties in with something that is really needed in 2025, which is people need to see you as a human, and you cannot regurgitate ChatGPT stuff, or you cannot just state facts. You need to back that up with experience, or kind of like connect to the listener somehow. You can't just go and just educate. They need to understand who you are as a business owner, what values you bring, and kind of like what foundational experience you have, so that they realize if you're the right person to work with them or not. But on Chris, he's questioning himself and be like, oh, I never thought about it like that. Or then he will like question the guests. So he's very inquisitive. And I think that that's really, really interesting to approach an interview from that point versus just like, tell me about this thing. No, let's actually have like a strategic conversation. Now, in terms of edits, these interviews are kind of like an hour, and they kind of feel, for the most part, almost like live to tape. I know that sometimes I can notice some edits, but for most of it, it isn't. And then for his solos, they're kind of like shorter episodes, under like 20 minutes for sure. And how is he structuring each episode? We have the guest hook, or his own hook, then topic introduction, and he asks a question that I personally don't like that people ask, and I recommend that people don't do it, which is, tell me about yourself. If you introduce your guest to your audience, I think that question sounds really weird, especially if you're like a very known person, as most of his guests are. And again, personal preference. There's, I'm sure, a reason why they do that. And you know, it's interesting sometimes to hear people's response to that, but overall, just not something that I like or recommend for most people. And then they break into the topic or into the interview, and then there's a call to action. What there is in the middle is that actual breaks for mid-roll ads, where he will say, you know, and now we'll take a break, and then it will say something like, oh, and now back into the conversation with Christo or something. So there are pre-planned breaks. Why this matters is that if you are part of a network or you plan to run ads specific to your programs, you have that done. You can do it programmatic, which is kind of using something in the system. If you're part of a network, you may run promos to other people's podcasts or other people's services. And then, you know, you can take them out and in. That is very common. So it kind of like prepares people for the future if they want to have ads. And then they have embraced video, but he does upload a video to Spotify. Not all episodes are video, but I think that is always like really cool to consider that you don't need to upload all of it. So let's move into the best practices followed on the podcast platforms. All right. So for Chris's podcast cover, he actually creates unique covers per episode. Jasmine doesn't. And his own podcast cover is bright yellow. And then there's a photo of him, a very unique photo. And he has glasses, hat, and then he's smiling. And then there's the future. Like his whole outfit is very vibey, very strong designer wise, right? So the future with Chris Chris Do is the name of the show, and then the title creator is the future. Now, he has multiple products, and so I can imagine that if you just have it with like the future, people could create something and take advantage of the name, and people think that they're listening to that podcast, and it's not. So I can understand why he would do that. The description kind of starts with the name again for SEO purposes. So it says, The Future Podcast is a show that explores the interesting overlap between design, marketing, and business. Our host and CEO of The Future, Chris Do, hold candid conversations with inspirational people from the worlds of design, technology, marketing, business, philosophy, and personal development. These conversations go deep, with the aim of understanding who these incredible people are, what drives them do what they do, and what we, the listener, can learn from it all. Visit thefuture.com/podcast for show notes and additional information for each episode. I mean, it doesn't say necessarily who this is for here, but I like that within the first 2 lines, again, it does say what the podcast is. And it says that, you know, he holds conversations with inspirational people, but it does sometimes these are, you know, solos. So it kind of like there's a little bit of a disconnect, but I do like that he does have a link for the podcast itself and for the show notes and for additional information. Now, he is using all 3 podcast categories, so that's awesome because, you know, again, you're showing on more different ones. And his audience is kind of more global, you can tell, because he has 1.3 thousand star reviews. He has a 4.9 rating on Spotify. And so that is something that I think really shows there. Moving into, again, is written in the third person because he has a team and he's sometimes like, there's like kind of like an ad for his production agency. So that kind of sets the expectation that it's not him. Obviously like writing the show notes, and he has, again, the idea is creating this kind of idea of celebrity. It makes sense, but if I was you, I wouldn't do that. It does not mention release day, but it does say that weekly episodes. Now, in terms of titles, he does use episode number. What he does say is EP, which I personally think that it may be a little bit of a waste of space because you have real estate that is very, very short on the titles. So you basically have a very little space to say what the podcast is about. So if you can use the numbers instead of just EP, better. In terms of the titles, they're also very concise. It doesn't lead with a guest name either, but I found some titles to be a little bit vague. Not all of them, but I found that some of them, they're really hard to tell what it is. But then, thinking through the listener journey, what I find I would not give great notes here is in the show notes. So on podcast platforms, each episode will start with, on this episode of the Future Podcast, Chris Do talks to, or talks with, or Chris Do talks to. So why this isn't great is because if you scroll down, every single show note starts with that and you're looking at it on your phone, you can't really preview what this is about, right? And so always start with a hook. What is this podcast about? How can you expand on the title? I also want you to know that he's also not maximizing the 4,000 characters. I just saw kind of like 2 paragraphs, you know, a little blurb about the guest. But I found like at some point like 25 links. And this is where if you have links about like basically preloaded links, the space is so long that it's visually a little kind of like not ideal. So if you can have maybe like 2 to 3 to 4 maybe links about the most important things. But for instance, he does link to the podcast the podcast platforms and his newsletter and his social media and the Future's newsletter and the Future on social media as a podcast. So there's like a lot of links. It's great for the first time person who's like, oh, let me go and follow them. But then if you're trying to find information, it's not really telling much like machines and humans what that episode is about. Chris is definitely taking advantage of the video element on Spotify, which I'm sure helps bring the podcast to more people. I haven't seen him use the clips, which you can do now, upload on the back end of Spotify for podcasters. He also invites people who are very popular or very known in the industry. A lot of times, people with teams test things and you think that you can't do that. And I was listening to Jake Klaus's podcast, and he was talking about how Stephen Bartlett has a failure / like experimentation team on his business that really tests a lot of different things on Diary of a CEO. And so basically, something that I even took notes of, Jay Class was talking about how when you have a team that is set up for experimentation, the more experiments you run, the more data you have, and so more information you can do. However, if you incentivize your team to only succeed, they're going to take less risks, right? So I think you want a high rate of experimentation. So remember that if you have never looked at your podcast analytics, which is something that I do with clients, and we look at how much are people consuming the podcast, like what's the percentage? Also, what's the retention rate for your audience? Are people staying longer? Are people like consuming a few episodes? Are people binging? This is really important. You need to test and you also need to review, right? And I find that when you're looking at bigger podcasters, sometimes there's that kind of like that expectation that you want to test, but you never look back at what the data tells you. And I find that that's true with a lot of the clients that I serve. I'll be like, oh, we tested this thing. Did you look at the data? And they'll go, oh, no. And so I'm like, let's look at the data, because data tells you if people clicked, if people didn't click, or if you need to run a few more tests, if that wasn't enough. And it really educates a lot of your decisions, right? When you're doing things, you need to know if they're working or not. Otherwise, you're just confusing your listeners. We need to make kind of outcomes out of this data. So to kind of like wrap it up, I want to talk about a few things from these two business owners who podcast. Treat your podcast like a business. Right? Like, I think it's really important that if you treat your business professionally, you treat your podcast professionally. You don't wait for the night before to record a podcast. You don't just invite the people you know, right? Like, you may have people you know or start there, but you need to expand your influence. And especially podcasts only grow if guests are sharing the show or if you have a good marketing plan in place. So I want you to make sure that your podcast is integrated within the content strategy that you have for your business as well, and that you are leveraging the podcast to get to your business goals. What you talk about and how you market the podcast is deeply connected to how the podcast will perform. So it's important that guests are strategic, that you're batching if you can, that if you're doing in-studio interviews, that you're embracing the assets that you have there. But also, if you don't have the capacity to do an in-person interview, you are recording the video. Now, all of these things hopefully got your wheels spinning, a lot of ideas of things that you can try. I'll have the links of everything. But before I go, I want to talk about the elephant in the room. So it's been 4 weeks since I released the previous episode of the podcast space, should I say the season preview. And I have not talked about this. I've been sick. I've been having a lot of client work, and I'll be honest, doing video is really a lot of more mental work. And so I told you all of these best practices, but I'm coming here in kind of being honest that sometimes you will do things to the standard that you don't want. And for me, I preferred waiting and telling you on Instagram that, I had to wait another week than, for instance, coming up with a content piece that I wasn't happy about. And so making those decisions and being truthful to your audience, even though, you're always 90% of the time, try to create the best possible content that you can and try to stay on top of things. And that's why batching is really important. Had I batched this episode ahead of time, I wouldn't have had this happen, right? So I'm calling myself out, but I want to let you know that if you're doing a season instead of like an episodic show, you cannot use like replays, right? You cannot use a lot of the strategies that I talked about that these creators are using. So it's very important that you allow yourself to make mistakes, yes, but kind of really understand that what other people are doing may not work for you. But what can you take from there and leverage that and see what works well? So this was me being honest. It's not great to share that when I, as an expert who, air quotes, should have it all figured out, makes mistakes, right? Or do things that I think that are, bad practice, or should I say like that? But having my guest, my dream guest, Denise Duffel-Thomas, on the podcast, which that interview is recorded already, and talk about how she is just figuring out. And a lot of times she's just testing things, and she's trying to allow herself to not take herself so seriously, or if she makes mistakes, to not be so hard on herself. And Honestly, I really needed to hear that, to hear someone who is incredibly accomplished to talk about mistakes that she also did. So just know we're all trying our best. I've been Anna Xavier, and I would like to invite you, if you want to look at your podcast strategy for 2026, if you're looking to better create content, to create sustainable ways to grow your podcast, I have openings that I'm working toward expanding. So basically, if you've been listening to this podcast, if you followed me on Instagram, or even if we met at a podcast conference, definitely reach out. Thepodcastspace.com is always the best place to go. You have one-to-one work, all the tabs on how to work with me. So links will be in the show notes as per usual. And just keep imperfect content going. And I'll see you in the next episode.